All right, so I think we're ready to go. Let's just dive right in. All right, so the title says The Next Frontier. Great. What exactly was that? And have we conquered it? Well, there's risk measurement, and no, we haven't conquered it in any concrete fashion just yet. But we've made great headway, as witnessed by all of you being here and by an institution like Carnegie Mellon supporting this and hosting this. So the tide is clearly turning, and further evidence comes from the things that Nick was talking about. So we should feel very good about the progress we're making, and again, you folks are sort of leading that charge in our industry, because of course there are a lot of people in our industry who aren't here, who either aren't yet aware or haven't really come to grips with the message we've been sending and the things we've been developing. So great progress, but there's more to be done, and that's really what I want to talk about today, is this next frontier. But before we tackle another frontier, I think we ought to listen to our Cheshire Cat friend from Alice in Wonderland and make sure we have in mind a clear objective. Where are we going? I mean, if we're going to be engaging in these battles, and they sometimes do feel like battles, I think, you need to know what you're fighting for, sort of the long-term view or vision. And so I want to start there. And this is how I see it. Enabling organizations to cost-effectively achieve and maintain an acceptable level of risk. If we can get to that point, then I think we can claim victory. But we're a long way from there for a lot of reasons. I mean, again, we're making great progress on the risk measurement component, but there are aspects of our industry today, which I'll be talking about, that I think pose obstacles, if you will, and things that need to be overcome. And that's this next frontier. So let me just run these bullets past you, right? Do the existence of well-documented policies and procedures, does that equal maturity? Or essential fundamental technologies being in place? Or active education awareness programs? Or personnel roles and responsibilities being clearly defined? Or boards of directors engaged in getting regular reports? Or risk registers tracking risks in an organization, having a risk appetite defined, or a metrics program in place. If you go into an organization, you see these things in place, would you call it mature? It depends. I mean, relatively, I think there are some questions that need to be asked. Right? What's missing, essentially? I would recast these statements for an organization to be mature. Are the appropriate policies and procedures in place? I have both been guilty of and witnessed to organizations that have policies. When I first stepped into my role as CISO at Nationwide Insurance, we had policies, absolutely. Nobody read them. Nobody knew. It was a complete waste of time to read them. In fact, they were so bad that I had a language expert come in and analyze them, and they were written at grade 21 in terms of their complexity. I didn't know there was a grade 21. Right? So we have a problem there. So I had them rewritten for the 8th grade level. Right? But we made a lot of other changes too, to make sure that they were the right policies. It isn't a matter of just having policies. I think it's the right policies. And when I look at many organizations I encounter today and the policies and such, very often they're aspirational. They're not enforced because they aren't a good fit for reality in terms of the business context and that sort of thing. So there are a host of problems there. Again, that would mean that's not a mature circumstance. Cost-effective security technologies are providing the intended value. Well, that's a little bit different than having, best practice technologies in place. Right? Having the right ones in place and making sure they're working as intended, that's different than just having technologies, or sort of the common technologies. An effective education awareness program. One of the things we did at Nationwide years ago was we identified very specific audiences and very specific messages for those audiences that were based, again, sort of on a fair analysis of what those people needed to know in order to be effective from a risk management perspective in their roles. That's very different than having, mom and apple pie sort of online survey or PowerPoint and a bunch of quizzes or something after that. That again, I see a lot of organizations have, but if they really given the information organizations really need, or the people in their organization really need to be effective. Again, that's different. Getting the right people in the right roles. Again, very different. And my pet peeve on this is the simple fact that in many organizations, anybody and their cousin gets to measure risk. Well, that's medium risk. Well, people may be wonderful security architects or auditors or forensics analysts or whatever your specialty is. That doesn't mean you're at all qualified to measure risk. Right? So having the right people in the right roles with the right skills, that's very different than having the right, having roles defined and people in place. Boards of directors getting the information they need. Well, the bottom line is almost never. And I recently raked a little muck in Columbus, Ohio at an event where I presented the 5 questions I think boards should be asking, and they aren't the questions they're asking. And they aren't questions we as a profession generally are able to answer because we don't pay attention to what I characterize as fundamentals. And we'll get into some of that in a little bit. Having a risk register tracking risks is not the same thing as having a risk register that actually has meaningful risk statements in it that are accurately measured and are being used to actively drive decisions. Having a clearly defined appetite, I don't run into that very often. How many people in here work for an organization that has a risk appetite statement? How many of you think it's clearly defined as actively driving decisions? Yeah, 1. And it's a fair shop, imagine that. Okay? And meaningful metrics. Again, we're great at counting things and running numbers, but that's, there's a difference between metrics and intelligence from the metrics, right? And that comes from analysis, right? So, that previous list that I think most of us in our industry, the way it behaves today, goes into an organization, yeah, they have policies in place and they have, they're meeting with the board and all these things, right? So they're mature. Not my experience. Not in terms of actually managing risk effectively, achieving and maintaining an acceptable level of risk over time. I'm not seeing it. Right? This is the next frontier. Right? We have to, now that we've come to understand that risk measurement can be licked, all right, let's tackle risk management seriously, right? And really look hard at best practices. So with that in mind, we have this risk management maturity survey that it's now in its 2nd year, and we'll go through some of the high-level findings. And it will, let me tell you a little bit about where it comes from and such. Essentially, the underlying premise of this maturity model is that there are 2 dimensions to maturity: the ability to make well-informed decisions and the ability to execute reliably. And the thing is, if you're doing that, if an organization is doing this, then all of those things in the previous slide that really reflect maturity should fall out from that, should materialize as a result, right? They'll be making the right decisions, well-informed decisions, have the right policies and those sorts of things, right? So this is the foundation to this survey, is evaluating the things that indicate whether an organization is making well-informed decisions and executing reliably. And each of these is decomposed into factors that create essentially a Bayesian network that underlies this. So it's not a checklist like we're used to seeing on NIST CSF or the other maturity models that we see out there are checklists of controls, right? Policies, reporting, technologies, these sorts of things like on that previous slide. You know, this isn't looking at that. This is looking at other things, which I'll get into. And more importantly, because it has this analytic underpinning that's reflected through the Bayesian network, it's capturing dependencies and relationships between these elements. So I think most of us recognize that some of the things like, let's just pick an easy one, logging is an important security function, right? But its value is muted if not completely undermined if there's no monitoring that goes on. So there's a dependency there, a Boolean and relationship, right? So the same thing or I should say, the checklists that pass as maturity models in our industry today, there is no capturing of relationships of the elements. First of all, I'd argue they're asking the wrong questions. You know, they're looking at the wrong pieces, but they also miss entirely the dependencies between the elements that they are looking at. So that by itself means the results should be highly questioned and should not be taken too seriously in terms of a real measure of efficacy. So here's the Bayesian network, and I'm not going to, you know, I know you can't read it. I can't read it from here either, but essentially it's not an incredibly complex thing. There are just 13 points, 13 elements. And down here is risk data quality. Over here is risk management data quality. Then there's analytics, you know, models and who's doing the analysis and whether they're qualified and so on. And this is, you know, the model's been published. It's out there if you're interested. And so that's what underlies this benchmark study. So the respondent data, we had 126 respondents, I believe. Where is it? 126 respondents. Last year we had 104, I believe it was. And so from these industries. And I suspect a lot of these are consulting and services, such. And these were the job titles that took part in it. I was pleased to see as many CISOs as we had. And by annual revenue, you know, a pretty good spread there. So let's look at the results. Drum roll, please. So, first of all, we had those questions where we gathered, you know, we asked them questions, they answered it, and that was translated into a Bayesian model, and then that was translated into a 0 to 100 score, because Bayesian results are hard to digest by themselves. And again, what this is trying to measure, and it's rough, you know, I think it's early days in terms of the model, but it's still, I think, very directionally correct. But it's, again, measuring an organization's ability to cost-effectively achieve and maintain an acceptable level of risk. And this is where they landed, all right? So this is not very good, and that's really good. And each of these tick marks represent where one of the companies that responded landed. And we can see where it lies on the continuum, kind of towards the low end, which means, generally speaking, our industry, or at least represented by this sample, is not very good at achieving, cost-effectively achieving and maintaining acceptable level of risk. Someone scored exceptionally well. I would love to meet that company. This was an anonymous survey, so I don't know who they were, but color me skeptical. All right. Maybe they were just messing with us, I don't know, but okay. But, you know, they're unicorns maybe. But at any rate, so you can see that as an industry, based on this measurement scale. Now, my experience would tell me, because I've done this in organizations, I've gone in and walked organizations through this analysis, and then walked them through, say, a NIST analysis or an FFIEC CAT analysis or something like that. And they score great on those. And then they take ours and they tank. In fact, I haven't walked an organization, walked them through this analysis, any organization that scored above 11. That should worry us. If we believe that what we're trying to measure here is important, and if we believe compliance and whatnot is really how we should be managing things, if that's the goal line, then yeah, let's not pay any attention to this. But if we think this is directionally correct, then this tells me we have a problem. We can see that there's a little bit of growth or improvement from 2017 to 2018. Yay, that's good. All right. Not dramatic by any means, but I'll take anything at this point. Interestingly, we had a survey regarding what frameworks or whether they're using FAIR or not. And see, those that are scored a little bit better. But, you know, I'd have to tell you too that there's a certain amount of bias in that regard because one of the questions being asked in the model is, are you using a formally defined risk measurement model? Okay, again, most organizations aren't, and so that runs against them. So I would be shocked if organizations using FAIR didn't score better, if for no other reason than that data point. And usage of risk terminology. Organizations that claimed to be, you know, really firmly focused on consistent, logical use of terminology scored better. And what's interesting is that's actually not part of the analytics. That data point is not within the calculus for the score. So it's interesting to see the correlation between, you know, stronger, more consistent use of terminology and a higher level of maturity in this. Okay, so the bottom line is the bad news is there's a lot of work to be done. The good news is, well, there's some improvement, and at least we have something to work from, I think. Right? So the new frontier I would propose is risk management maturity, because I think as an industry, we're missing the point. It's not about whether you have policies or you're reporting to the board or any of that. Those are artifacts. Those are things that are not, that's like trying to gauge the maturity of a teenager because they dress nicely, drive a nice car, and get good grades. That doesn't mean I trust them with anything important necessarily, right? I was one of those kids, and I wouldn't have trusted me, right, when I was 16 or 17. So it's, you know, maturity is different. It's, again, as an industry, I would say the things we're calling maturity models really aren't maturity models, not in any real important sense. So the path ahead, and when I was putting this slide together, you know, when I go out to Bing and I go out to pictures or images, and I put in the phrase I'm trying to find a picture for, and I put in sort of the path ahead, and it came up with these pictures of, you know, sunsets and this straight highway leading off into the sunset on this nice, you know, paved road, and I thought, no, that's not it at all. This is what it's going to look like. This is what it's going to feel like. How many people in here have been involved in the FAIR sort of community for 5 years or more? Raise your hands. A few of you. 2 years or more. A few more, okay. A lot of newcomers here. Well, those of you who have been, you know, on the first frontier, you know, the current frontier on risk measurement, ask any of them and they'll tell you it has been a slog. There's so much inertia to overcome, so many bad practices and misperceptions and that sort of thing. It's been a slog. added to just the natural human tendency to resist change. I think this next frontier is likely to be even more difficult in some respects. But it's a frontier worth engaging, certainly if we take our responsibilities seriously as professionals. So the challenges, well, again, the innate resistance to change, continued, addiction to zero-cost risk measurement, where people just wave a wet finger in the air, where all the cost comes later in terms of wasted resources and incidents that shouldn't happen if the organization were managing risk well. I think people, I do too, I like easy buttons, but the fact is, I don't think there is an easy button for our problem space. Anybody who tells you there is, probably hasn't thought very deeply about it. Shortcuts and posers. So as risk has gotten, to be a more important term in our industry, a lot of people and vendors and such are climbing on the bandwagon, but very often haven't really taken the time to understand the bandwagon they're climbing on or how closely they fit and what part of the puzzle they solve. So you have to be careful out there. I think that as tough as the battles have been around risk measurement, I don't know anybody who would really argued hard that what was being done was good. They might say it was good enough. They might say, well, quantitative analysis isn't possible. They might pose that argument. But I don't remember people ever arguing that it was good, the risk measurement practices. I think in this next frontier, we're going to run into people who think they've got it nailed. This is a standard. This is a whatever. We've been doing it for a year. Oh, everybody knows this is a good risk model or a risk maturity model. So I think there could be greater inertia in that regard. Blind faith and the wisdom in the crowd. This can be frustrating, and it's something we will continue to face. And are we really expert today? I think we're proficient, but that's different than expert. Expertise requires understanding. And again, I think too often we fall back on the easy answers and checklists and that sort of thing rather than really understanding our problem space. So what will it take to make meaningful changes? Understanding why. Asking hard questions. Don't settle for the easy answer, because our problem space is complex and dynamic. I think there are very few easy answers. We have to recognize that if we're going to deal with it effectively. I think we have to help people come to terms with the downsides for how we're currently managing things. We have to be able to articulate clearly why they don't work and the effects of that. And of course, we have to provide them better alternatives, right? We can't just whine about the current state. We have to actually do the hard work of saying this is going to be better and for these reasons, right? People only change if there's something better. And continuing to help evolve expertise in risk management. And again, the fact that we have so many people in the Fair Institute and so many people here and places like Carnegie Mellon who are committed to evolving the profession, that's tremendously good news and incredibly important to our future as a profession. Because certainly the next generation should come in the door not having to overcome the biases and misperceptions that maybe some folks in the profession currently have to wrestle with. And I think a key too will be higher expectations set by the stakeholders we serve, the boards and regulators, and I would say Big Four consulting firms and that sort of thing play a tremendously important role in this as well. And I already talked about that. So I think this quote is incredibly important. Yes, we know we need to patch better. We know we need people to not click on phishing emails. We know one thing or another. But very little of what I see in terms of how we're addressing these things goes to root cause. We aren't taking the time to understand why. And we have to change that. That if we want to be mature as a profession and be effective as a profession, that has to change. We have to be more demanding. We have to ask harder questions. And this one too, back to that easy button thing. Anybody who tells you that they can fully automate the risk profile of an organization, yeah, well, again, color me skeptical. I think when you oversimplify things, you lose its essence, and you tend to lose accuracy and meaningfulness. So, yeah, it needs to be as easy as possible, but we should be very sensitive to oversimplification. The easy answers are not easy. How many people in here are familiar with this book, Thinking Fast and Slow? I love this book, okay? And if you've read it already, I encourage you to read the first part again because of how they describe System 1 and System 2 thinking. System 1 thinking is fast, it's reflexive, involuntary, it's sort of how we react in the moment. And we developed that as a species on the plains of the savannah or wherever we evolved in dealing with what is essentially a much, much simpler environment. And it's great for simple, non-complex problems. Right? It absolutely stinks in the face of complexity. System 2 is this slower analytic thinking that is our error correction and how we deal with complex problems. The challenge is human beings only go to System 2. We will rely on System 1 always. If our System 1, that reflexive answer, if we have an answer that isn't apparently wrong or problematic. And studies around this have been very conclusive. But when I look at it's medium, or yeah, we scored 3.5 on a NIST CSF checklist sort of thing, those are perfect representations of System 1 thinking. Okay? And in our problem space, System 1 is going to do nothing but get us in trouble. All right? So we have to do a lot more System 2 thinking, and because we will always still do System 1 thinking. There is no way around that. It's how we're wired. We can calibrate our beliefs and understanding. I still do System 1 thinking, but I am very sensitive to potential for System 1 leading me astray, so I much more quickly engage System 2. Right? Plus, my mental models for risk, at least, hopefully, one would hope, are a little better calibrated, so I'm less likely to make gross errors with System 1 than I might otherwise. But I think this is an important thing to recognize, and I think if you haven't read this book, you should. And if you have read this book, you might want to revisit it in this context. So, again, I'm running a little bit short on time, so I'm going to just rush through this. But again, if we were to ask which of the following are risks, which I do in almost every presentation I give, and the answer I always get is all of them are risks. None of them are risks. They're all part of the risk landscape, but they aren't risks. But again, how our profession operates and the way we use terminologies and kind of the mental models that we're accustomed to, well, System 1 is telling us these are risks. No, they're not. All right? And so when we rely on these sorts of things, again, we're engaging System 1, right and left. Okay? But for most of our problem space, that's not going to serve us well. Even the results from this Bayesian maturity model I put together, if all we do is go, oh, well, we scored 25, and that's where we leave it, well, we've just sort of blindly accepted a model and measurement method and that sort of thing. And, I don't believe in dogma, right? I believe in hard questions, exploration. And that's how we evolve and become better and better at what we do and more effective. Again, nothing inherently wrong with System 1 thinking, but We have to calibrate it. We have to recognize its limitations. Very quickly, too, I think just in terms of how we can think about the process of overcoming cultural inertia and the resistance to change. I think very often human beings are herding animals, kind of that belongingness needs in the middle of this. To overcome that, I think we have to help people recognize that really safety is at stake here. And when I think back at my own journey in developing FAIR, I had sort of a bucket of cold water thrown in my face by an executive who essentially pointed out to me that I was clueless about risk, and that's what started me down the FAIR path. And really what he did was he challenged my safety. I was not feeling secure in my job as CISO at Nationwide because this executive just pointed out that I was clueless. All right? So for the next now 15 years, dozen years or so, I forget, I gave up belonging to the herd, the information security herd, and the esteem needs, because I needed to address the safety thing. That's what drove me to develop FAIR. I needed to understand. I'm wired that way. I need to understand what's going on in order to feel safe. Now, fortunately, because of people like you and the others involved in the FAIR Institute and that sort of thing, this belongingness need of mine is being met, right? So that's good. But so that safety, the feeling of safety around risk measurement, for me, that's now satisfied, and I think should begin to be satisfied for our profession as we get more and more involved in good risk measurement. So on a personal level, as professionals, I think we can hopefully make ourselves feel more safer, and then because we've developed our own little herd here, we can satisfy that need. But I think for organizations, we have the same opportunity to help organizations recognize that what they're doing today, and Nick mentioned it with Department of Homeland Security and others saying, we're pouring boatloads of money at this problem, bad things are still happening. And we all recognize there's no such thing as perfect security and bad things are still going to happen. But I think if you look at any of the major breaches, and you look at really what happened there, things that weren't patched, or assets that nobody knew they were there, there was a visibility problem, those sorts of things. I feel like we have all this evidence, this data is accumulating that what we're doing as a profession isn't really working well. And we should, I think we should take that to heart and recognize that if it's not working well, that means ultimately, regardless of whether we belong to the herd, safety's at stake. So I think that's part of the message we need to help convey in the industry, is it's belonging in us is not as important, shouldn't be as important as actually being effective. So the bottom line, again, the overall objective, I would argue, is cost-effective management of risk, achieving and maintaining an acceptable level of risk over time. And we've made wonderful progress. And I mean, one of the great things about our profession is there's so many really smart people who take our jobs incredibly seriously. I don't know anybody, I can't really think of anybody in our profession who just sort of doesn't care. I mean, we care, and that's great. It's just we need better information about how to be more effective. And this second frontier, I think, is important if we want to continue to make progress. It will accelerate the progress on the measurement front, but it also will help us avoid some of the mistakes I think we're making from analyzing our organization's profiles today to really understand how effective we are. And again, I think I found it to really be useful to think in these terms of System 1 and System 2 thinking. So the opportunity exists to to dramatically improve our situation as a profession, our efficacy, and let's go do it. So thank you for coming, and enjoy the next couple of days.